There are moments in life when God calls us into solitude, not to punish us, but to prepare us. In these seasons of being alone, it may feel as though the world has turned its back on us, but in truth, it is God drawing us closer to Himself. Being alone is not isolation. It is consecration. It is in these quiet, sacred moments that God does His deepest work within us. Throughout Scripture, we see this pattern. Before God used Moses to deliver His people, He led him into the wilderness. Before David became king, he was alone tending sheep in the fields. Even the Apostle Paul spent years in obscurity after his conversion, being prepared for the mission ahead. And most profoundly, Jesus Himself often withdrew to lonely places to pray and commune with the Father. These were not wasted moments, they were moments of transformation. When God brings us into a season of solitude, it's natural to feel as though we've been set aside, forgotten, or even punished. However, solitude is not punishment, it is preparation. God's ways are higher than ours, and His plans often unfold in ways we don't immediately understand. Being alone is not a sign of His absence, but rather an indication of His intentional work within us. This season is a sacred opportunity for transformation, a divine appointment to be shaped and prepared for what lies ahead. In life, we often equate activity and busyness with progress. We assume that the more we do, the closer we are to achieving our goals. But God doesn't measure progress the way we do. He knows that true growth, the kind that lasts, happens in the stillness. When we're alone, without the distractions of the world, we're positioned to experience the depth of His work in our hearts. Solitude allows God to clear away the noise and speak to us directly, addressing the areas in our lives that need refining. It is in these moments of quiet that He does His deepest work, preparing us for the future He has already planned. Consider the example of a potter working with clay. Before the clay can become a beautiful vessel, it must first be placed on the wheel. The potter works with care, shaping and molding the clay, but this process cannot happen in chaos. The potter requires focus, and the clay must remain pliable and still. In the same way, when God calls us into solitude, He is placing us on His wheel, shaping us into the vessel He needs for His purposes. This process may feel lonely, but it is far from purposeless. Each moment is deliberate, each touch intentional. In solitude, God strips away the things we often rely on for identity and purpose. The opinions of others, the busyness of schedules, and even our own ambitions can cloud our understanding of who we are and what we are meant to do. In the quiet, God brings us back to the core of our identity, His creation, loved and called according to His purpose. This is not a time of inactivity, but a time of active preparation. It's in these moments that God builds in us the character, faith, and resilience needed for the path ahead. Many of the greatest leaders and figures in Scripture experienced seasons of solitude before stepping into their calling. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before returning to Egypt to lead the Israelites. During those years, God was preparing him, teaching him humility and dependence. David, anointed as king in his youth, spent years in obscurity tending sheep and later fleeing from Saul. In those solitary moments, he developed the heart of a worshiper and the courage of a warrior. These were not wasted years, they were formative. God was equipping them for the magnitude of their future roles. When we find ourselves in solitude, it's easy to focus on what we've lost: companionship, recognition, or the comfort of familiar routines. But God wants us to shift our perspective. Solitude is not about loss, it's about gain. It is in these quiet seasons that we gain clarity, strength, and purpose. God uses this time to remove the things that hinder us and to pour into us the qualities we will need to fulfill His calling. What feels like a delay is, in reality, a time of divine acceleration as God works beneath the surface to prepare us for the breakthroughs to come. Solitude also serves to deepen our relationship with God. When we are alone, we are more attuned to His presence. Without the distractions of the world, we can hear His voice more clearly, sense His guidance more profoundly, and experience His love more intimately. This connection is foundational for everything else in our lives. It is what sustains us when we face challenges and what anchors us when we are called to greater heights. The season of solitude is not easy. It requires patience, trust, and faith in God's plan. But it is a necessary part of the journey. God does not waste anything. Every moment spent in solitude is part of His greater design to prepare you for the future He has in store. The solitude is not a punishment. It is his invitation to grow, transform, and be made ready for the destiny he has prepared for you. In the unfolding narrative of Scripture, we see a recurring pattern. God often calls his chosen ones into solitude before using them for extraordinary purposes. This divine strategy is not random or incidental. It is intentional. The periods of solitude serve as a crucible, a place where faith is forged, character is refined, and purpose is solidified. These moments of isolation are not signs of God withholding his blessing, but rather his way of preparing his servants for the magnitude of the work he has for them. Moses is a powerful example of this pattern. Born into a time of oppression, rescued by divine intervention, and raised in Pharaoh's palace, he seemed destined for greatness. Yet before Moses could become the deliverer of Israel, he spent 40 years in the wilderness. From a worldly perspective, this seemed like a step backward, a fall from privilege and power to obscurity. But in God's perspective, the wilderness was a place of preparation. During those years, Moses learned humility, patience, and dependence on God, qualities he would need as he led a rebellious nation through the desert for another 40 years. It was in solitude that Moses encountered God in the burning bush, a defining moment that launched him into his calling. David's life follows a similar pattern. Anointed by Samuel as a young shepherd, David was chosen by God to be king over Israel. But before he could ascend to the throne, he spent years in obscurity. Much of this time was spent alone, tending sheep in the fields or fleeing for his life from King Saul. These years were not wasted, they were formative. In the solitude of the fields, David developed a heart of worship and a deep trust in God. He learned to fight lions and bears, skills that would later enable him to face Goliath and lead armies. The wilderness was where David's character was tested and refined, preparing him for the weight of leadership. The Apostle Paul provides another striking example. After his dramatic conversion on the road to Damascus, Paul did not immediately begin his ministry. Instead, he spent several years in Arabia and other regions in relative obscurity. During this time, he was taught by God, growing in understanding and faith. This season of solitude was essential for Paul to transition from being a persecutor of Christians to one of the most influential apostles in history. His letters, written in later years, reveal the depth of wisdom and revelation that came from his time alone with God. Even Jesus himself followed this pattern. Before he began his public ministry, he spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and communing with the Father. This time of solitude was a pivotal moment where he was tested by the enemy and strengthened in his mission. Throughout his ministry, Jesus would often withdraw to solitary places to pray. These moments of being alone with the Father were not signs of weakness, but sources of renewal and power. This pattern is not limited to biblical figures. It is a principle that applies to us today. When God calls us into solitude, it is often because he is preparing us for something greater. The solitude is a training ground, a place where he shapes our hearts and minds to align with his will. It is in these moments that we learn to trust him more deeply, to depend on him more fully, and to hear his voice more clearly. The solitude also reveals our true character. When we are alone, there is no audience, no applause, no distractions. It is just us and God. This raw and unfiltered space allows God to address areas in our lives that need healing or growth. He strips away the mask we wear and works on the parts of us that are hidden from others but fully known to him. The recurring theme in these examples is that solitude is not a time of punishment, but a divine strategy for preparation. It is in the quiet places, away from the noise and distractions of life, that God shapes us into vessels ready to carry out his purpose. This process is not always comfortable, but it is always purposeful. It is a sign that God is at work, laying the foundation for the greater things he has planned for us. In the fast-paced world we live in, silence can feel unsettling and solitude might seem like an interruption to our plans. However, when God draws us into a season of stillness, it's not to leave us in silence, but to bring us closer to him. Intimacy with God thrives in the stillness, and in this sacred quiet, his voice becomes clearer, his presence more tangible, and his plans more evident. These are the moments when we come to understand his heart and his purpose for our lives. Life is filled with noise, both external and internal. From the constant buzz of technology and the demands of others to the chatter of our own thoughts and fears, it can be difficult to hear God's voice in the chaos. Yet God often waits for us to step into the quiet to reveal himself. It is not because he cannot speak in the noise, but because we are more attuned to listen in the stillness. He wants us to set aside distractions so that we can focus entirely on Him, for it is in these moments of focused stillness that He speaks the loudest. Throughout the Bible, God has shown a consistent pattern of meeting His people in solitude to reveal His plans and deepen their relationship with Him. Take Elijah, for example. After a dramatic confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Elijah fled into the wilderness, feeling defeated and alone. In his solitude, he encountered God not in the earthquake, wind, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. This moment was a profound reminder that God's voice often comes not in the dramatic, but in the still, quiet moments of our lives. The quietness of solitude allows us to see ourselves and our circumstances from God's perspective. When we're caught up in the busyness of life, we can lose sight of His greater purpose. We may rely too heavily on our own understanding or become distracted by temporary concerns. In solitude, God realigns our focus. He opens our eyes to what truly matters and reveals His plans, which are far greater than anything we could imagine on our own. This is why stillness is not a waste of time, but an investment in clarity and direction. Spending time alone with God also deepens our relationship with Him. Just as human relationships flourish when given time and attention, our relationship with God grows stronger when we intentionally spend time in His presence. In solitude, we move beyond surface-level prayers and begin to pour out our hearts to Him. We open ourselves to His truth, His comfort, and His guidance. These moments are where intimacy with God takes root, transforming our faith from something external to something deeply personal and life-changing. Solitude helps us learn the art of listening. In our prayers, we often do most of the talking, presenting God with our requests and concerns. But in solitude, we are invited to listen. God has things to say to us, words of wisdom, encouragement, correction, and love. In the quiet, we begin to recognize His voice, distinguishable from all others, and learn to trust it. This ability to hear God is not just for the moment. It becomes a vital skill for navigating life's challenges and decisions. The intimacy developed in solitude also gives us strength for the journey ahead. Knowing God on a deeper level equips us to face difficulties with confidence and to walk in obedience even when it's difficult. When we have spent time in His presence, we carry His peace and assurance with us, enabling us to stand firm in faith no matter what comes our way. These moments of stillness become the foundation upon which we build our lives. Solitude may feel like an interruption, but it is actually a divine invitation. It is an opportunity to encounter God in a way that is often missed in the noise of everyday life. He calls us into stillness not to leave us there, but to transform us, to draw us closer, and to reveal Himself in ways that can only be experienced in the quiet. When God allows a season of solitude, it can feel like a stripping away of everything familiar and comforting. The absence of people, activities, and the usual sources of support can leave us wondering why we have been left so seemingly alone. However, this solitude is not meant to isolate us permanently, but to teach us one of life's most profound truths. Our ultimate reliance must be on God and God alone. He uses these moments to remind us that His presence and provision are all we truly need. As human beings, we are often tempted to place our trust in external things, relationships, careers, finances, or even our own abilities. These things can provide a sense of security, but they are not infallible. They can fail us. And when they do, it leaves us feeling vulnerable and uncertain. God, in His infinite wisdom, sometimes removes these supports temporarily, not to harm us, but to redirect our dependence to Him. He is the only unchanging, unfailing foundation on which we can truly rely. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness after leaving Egypt is a powerful example of this principle. For 40 years, they wandered through a barren desert where there were no natural resources to sustain them. They had to depend on God daily for their survival. He provided manna from heaven, water from a rock, and protection from their enemies. This dependence was not meant to be a burden, but a lesson in trust. God was teaching them that He alone was their provider and that His provision was sufficient for every need. In solitude, we are stripped of the distractions and false securities that can cloud our understanding of who God is. It's easy to rely on others when they're around, to seek validation and support from friends, family, or colleagues. But in the absence of these voices, we are left with God's voice alone. This is where we learn to lean on Him for wisdom, strength, and comfort. We discover that His guidance is trustworthy and that He is always present, even when others are not. Consider the story of Job, a man who lost everything: his wealth, his children, and his health. Even his friends, though present physically, offered no real comfort. In his suffering and solitude, Job had no choice but to turn to God. It was in this vulnerable state that he encountered God in a profound way. Through this experience, Job's understanding of God deepened, and he came to realize that even when everything else is taken away, God remains faithful and sovereign. The Apostle Paul also experienced this lesson during his ministry. Writing from prison, Paul spoke of learning the secret of contentment, whether in abundance or in need. He declared that he could do all things through Christ who strengthened him. This wasn't a theoretical statement. It was born out of experience. Paul had faced shipwrecks, beatings, hunger, and betrayal, yet in all of it, he learned to rely not on his circumstances, but on the sustaining power of God. When we learn to depend on God alone, we develop a strength and resilience that cannot be shaken by external circumstances. This dependence allows us to face challenges with confidence, knowing that God is in control. It also frees us from the fear of loss as we come to understand that our true security is not found in the things or people around us, but in our relationship with God. This reliance also transforms the way we view solitude. Instead of seeing it as an empty or lonely time, we begin to see it as a sacred space where God works most deeply in our lives. In solitude, God speaks to our hearts, reassures us of his love, and equips us for the journey ahead. It is a time when we are reminded that he is the source of all we need, our strength, our peace, and our purpose. Dependence on God is not a weakness, but a strength. It shifts our focus from what we lack to what he provides, from our limitations to his limitless power. In solitude, God draws us closer to him, teaching us to trust him fully and preparing us to walk with confidence in the path he has set before us. Solitude has a way of exposing the depths of our hearts in a way that no other experience can. When we are alone, stripped of distractions and away from the noise of life, we are left with the raw truth of who we are, our thoughts, emotions, fears, and desires laid bare before God. It is in these moments that God begins the deep work of refining us, shaping our character, and addressing the parts of us that need healing and growth. This process, though often uncomfortable, is a vital step in becoming who God has created us to be. When we are surrounded by people and activities, it's easy to avoid confronting the deeper issues within us. We can bury our insecurities under busyness, mask our pain with social interaction, and ignore our flaws by focusing on the flaws of others. But in solitude, there is no one else to distract us or to blame. It's just in God. And in this sacred space, he invites us to confront the truths we've been avoiding. This process of refinement often begins with an honest examination of our hearts. As the psalmist wrote, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." Psalm 139, 23, 24. When we ask God to search our hearts, we are opening ourselves to his transformative work. He reveals the areas where we have fallen short, the wounds we've carried for too long, and the habits that are hindering our growth. Take the story of Jacob as an example. Jacob spent much of his early life deceiving others to gain what he wanted: his brother's birthright, his father's blessing, and even his success with Laban. But one night, alone by the river, Jacob wrestled with God. This moment of solitude was pivotal. In that wrestling, Jacob was forced to confront his own nature, his fears, and his need for God. By the end of the night, he was no longer the same man. God gave him a new name, Israel, signifying the transformation that had taken place. Jacob's encounter with God in solitude changed the course of his life and legacy. God uses solitude to refine not only our actions, but also our motives. Sometimes we do the right things for the wrong reasons. We may serve others for recognition or pursue success to satisfy our ego. In solitude, God shines a light on these hidden motives and helps us realign our hearts with his purposes. This refinement purifies our intentions, enabling us to serve him with a sincere and undivided heart. Another aspect of refinement is healing. Many of us carry wounds from past experiences, rejections, betrayals, failures that we have never fully addressed. In the stillness of solitude, God brings these wounds to the surface, not to harm us, but to heal us. He is the great physician who binds up the brokenhearted and sets the captives free. Healing is a process, and solitude provides the space for God to work on the deepest parts of our being, restoring us to wholeness. Solitude also tests and strengthens our faith. When we are alone, we must rely on God in ways we might not when surrounded by others. It is in these moments that our trust in Him is stretched and deepened. We learn to walk by faith, not by sight, as we depend on His promises rather than our circumstances. This strengthening of faith equips us to face challenges with resilience and to stand firm in our calling. Refinement in solitude is not about perfection but transformation. It's about allowing God to shape us into the image of Christ, to align our character with His, and to prepare us for the work He has set before us. The process may be painful at times, as it often requires letting go of old habits, mindsets, and even relationships that no longer serve God's purpose for our lives. But the result is a life that reflects His glory and fulfills His purpose. In solitude, God does the deep work that can only be accomplished in the quiet, undistracted moments. It is a refining fire that purifies us, strengthens us, and prepares us for the next season of life. It is a reminder that we are not finished products, but works in progress, continually being shaped by the hands of the Master. Through solitude, God calls us closer to Him, transforming us into vessels fit for His use. When God brings you into a season of solitude, it is not only to refine you, heal you, and deepen your intimacy with Him, but also to prepare you for the unique purpose He has placed on your life. In the quiet and stillness, He works to equip you with the tools, wisdom, and resilience you will need to fulfill your calling. This preparation often occurs away from the eyes of others, in a hidden place where the lessons are personal and profound, molding you into someone ready to step into what God has planned for you. Consider the life of David before he became king. Long before he stood before Goliath or ruled Israel, David was a shepherd tending to his father's sheep in the solitude of the fields. Day after day he was alone, surrounded by nothing but nature and the presence of God. It was in this hidden place that God prepared David. He learned courage by defending the flock from lions and bears. He developed faith by trusting God in the wilderness. And he honed his skill with the sling, an ability that would later bring him victory over Goliath. What appeared to be an ordinary, isolated life was actually a season of divine preparation for an extraordinary destiny. Similarly, Moses spent 40 years in the desert before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. During those years of solitude, God was not absent. He was preparing Moses. The desert became a training ground where Moses learned humility, patience, and dependence on God, qualities that would be essential for leading a nation. The solitude was not a detour, but a necessary phase in Moses' journey toward his calling. When God sets you apart in solitude, He often places you in a season of learning. This is a time to absorb His word, to grow in prayer, and to develop a deeper understanding of His ways. It's a period of sharpening your spiritual discernment so you can recognize His voice amidst the noise of life. Like a student in a classroom, you are being equipped with the knowledge and skills that will be crucial in the next phase of your journey. Preparation in solitude is also about building inner strength and resilience. Life will inevitably bring challenges, and stepping into your purpose often comes with resistance. In the quiet, God fortifies your spirit, teaching you to trust Him fully and to stand firm in the face of adversity. This is where perseverance is cultivated, where faith is strengthened, and where you learn to rely on His strength rather than your own. The solitude acts as a crucible, refining you and building the endurance necessary for the road ahead. In this time of preparation, God often reveals more about your identity and purpose. He clarifies the gifts and talents He has placed within you and shows you how they align with His plan. It is in these moments of quiet reflection and communion with Him that you begin to see yourself not through the lens of the world, but through His eyes. This newfound clarity empowers you to walk confidently in your calling, free from the need for external validation. Solitude is also where God teaches obedience. In the stillness, away from the opinions and expectations of others, you learn to say yes to His will, even when it's difficult or unclear. Obedience becomes less about external pressure and more about an internal commitment to follow His lead. This kind of obedience, forged in solitude, is what allows you to step boldly into your purpose, trusting that He has equipped you for whatever lies ahead. Though the season of solitude may feel long and uncertain, it is never without purpose. God uses this time to prepare you in ways you cannot fully understand until later. He is weaving together the threads of your experiences, shaping your character, and equipping you with everything you need for the next chapter of your life. The solitude is not wasted. It is a sacred space where you are being made ready for the plans He has already set in motion. When the time comes to step into your purpose, the preparation you received in solitude will become evident. You will find that the lessons learned, the strength gained, and the faith deepened in the quiet moments with God were exactly what you needed to fulfill your calling. This is the beauty of God's design. He uses the hidden seasons to prepare you for the visible ones, ensuring that you are ready to walk boldly in the purpose He has prepared for you. In solitude, God works to refine, heal, and prepare us for the purpose He has set before us. Though it may feel like a season of isolation, it is actually a divine opportunity to grow deeper in dependence on Him, develop character, and be equipped for what lies ahead. Through this hidden preparation, we come to understand our true identity, strengthen our faith, and gain the resilience needed to fulfill our calling. Ultimately, solitude is not a detour, but a vital part of God's plan, shaping us into the person He created us to be.